Давайте восклицать, друг другом восхищаться. Высокопарных слов не надо опасаться. Давайте говорить друг другу комплименты, ведь это все любви, счастливые моменты. Давайте горевать и плакать откровенно, то вместе, то повровь, а то попеременно. Не надо придавать значения злословию, поскольку грусть всегда соседствует с любовью. Давайте понимать друг друга с полуслова, чтоб, ошибившись раз, не ошибиться снова.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I welcome you to Rashkin Report, a channel where sometimes we speak Russian, sometimes we speak English, and you got to just double check to make sure. But I'm super excited to be having this conversation in English because I'm excited to welcome to the program. We're like having a steel cage match of two book authors, but I'm really excited always to see Mark Pomar, author of Cold War Radio, on Rashkin Report. And we're super excited to welcome author of To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, Dr. Benjamin Nathans, who is a author and editor of 5 books, among them Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia. Let's see, the number of prize awards is just overwhelming. And of course, Success of Our Hopeless Cause. Dr. Nathans also teaches University of Pennsylvania, and we welcome you to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Always great to be with you.
Well, we are looking at a book that is, on one hand, something that we can weigh in. So I can speak Russian and say anything. But on the other hand, the topic seems rather universal and very pertinent and relevant and poignant, which is dissidence. And that's not even opposition necessarily. That's like a different level. That's dissidence. Dr. Nathans, could you explain what made you want to write this book? It's this. It's a fundamental manuscript of over 800 pages of all these people that were Russian Soviet dissidents. Why do you feel that is important? Why did you feel it was important to write this book?
Thank you. When I began working on this book, I really was most interested in recapturing the lives of the people who made this movement, because I thought that it was emblematic for how people who live in authoritarian, non-democratic societies generally think about and act on their options for political engagement. And as you said a moment ago, that is truly a global theme, a theme that resonates and has resonated in many, many different countries. I found the Soviet example, that is the example of Soviet dissidents, particularly powerful because, as I learned, the more and more I read and started digging around in the archives, such a high proportion of them have actually left versions of their own life stories in the forms of memoirs and autobiographies. At this point, I'm surprised when I come across a dissident who hasn't produced a memoir. Some of the reasons for this are pretty clear. There was a very high proportion of members of the intelligentsia, a highly literate, text-centric group involved in the movement. But for the historian, this is a goldmine because it gives us entree into so many fascinating life stories. It's also a bit treacherous because it's easy to become hostage of these individual life stories and to see the movement as a series of individual trajectories. And what I wanted to do was to create a group portrait and to look at the relationships among dissidents, to sort of treat them the way an ethnographer might, observing a strange and interesting tribe in a quite remarkable project of setting limits on Soviet power.
What is the impact do you feel that they had?
Certainly not what they intended. The goal of the dissident movement, and by that I mean, above all, the people who were called pravozащитники, the rights defenders, was to first spread legal consciousness across the Soviet population to make Soviet citizens more conscious of the rights that they already had, rights that were inscribed in the Soviet Constitution, the Code of Criminal Procedure, and other documents, and also to act on those rights, to act as if those rights actually meant something and had traction in the lives of people who were repressed or otherwise came into some kind of collision with the powers of the state. And of course, the ultimate goal was to exercise a form of a kind of containment of the Soviet state from within by using its own legal system. I use the word containment because I do see it as a counterpart to the American policy of containment that was thought up and made famous by George Kennan, the Cold War policy of containment. But what the dissidents had in mind was analogous but quite different. It was supposed to unfold from within the Soviet system. It was supposed to be organic, utterly nonviolent, and, as I said, harnessing Soviet law to put limits on what the state could and could not do. So in this respect, if you'll indulge me, it's kind of like the martial art form known as jiu-jitsu, where you use the opponent's weight against that opponent. So the strategy was extremely simple and extremely clever. Pressure the Soviet government to observe its own existing legal structures.
Mark, go ahead.
I was going to say that what has intrigued me about, first of all, the book, and I need to make this point to all of our listeners, is really a superb book, well worth reading for many different reasons, in addition to what Professor Nathan just pointed out. It's also a, if I may say, a kind of thoughtful analysis of how human societies function in general. And there are many points in the book that really opened up for me the dissident movement in a way that I had not thought about them. For example, the resistance, and I would love to have your thoughts on this, Ben, the resistance that some of, for example, Sakharov's colleagues felt that by doing this dissident work, they were actually undercutting the progress that was being made, and that we could get ahead. And here you are irritating the Soviet authorities with your insistence on allowing so-and-so to emigrate, or having this person's ability to publish samizdat and so forth. And you're wrecking something that's improving. And it really reminded me, I worked at the radios, both at Voice of America and RFERL, and some of my friends in the academic world would tell me much the same thing. Why are you broadcasting about these dissidents? Don't you realize you're just irritating the Soviet Union? You're making them more harsh. You are exacerbating the situation rather than calming it down and bringing détente to a success. So in many ways, I saw our role at the radios as the logical partner of the dissidents. And I hope we can get into some of that, because I think it's a very interesting other side of the whole coin. Without
Absolutely.
Radio Liberty, without VOA, without BBC, without Deutsche Welle, without Kol Israel, and many other international broadcasters, the dissidents would be a pretty small group making a certain amount of noise in a few apartments in Moscow, but not necessarily being known outside of those narrow circles. And it's the radios that made them famous all over the country.
Absolutely. And as many of the listeners to this program, I think, will know, those shortwave radio broadcasts were collectively known as the Voices, playing off the Voice of America as one of the most widely listened to stations. There's so much to be said on that note. And if you just think about what kind of communication model we're talking about here, where dissident scientists and writers and others would produce hand-typed samizdat texts in their apartments. Those texts would circulate in a kind of chain letter hand distribution network. But the few copies that were smuggled abroad then became part of a much larger, truly global network of communication in the hands of the various shortwave radio broadcasters that you mentioned, many of which, it needs to be said, especially in their early years, were financed by the secret services of the Western states. That was a fact that was revealed in the middle of the 1960s and that temporarily caused a scandal for some of those broadcasting services, but it did nothing to diminish their reach and their influence among their listeners.
You know,
Historians, I was just going to say, historians have always struggled to put numbers on the listeners and the readers of Samizdat, and it's very difficult to do so. I myself did quite a bit of research trying to ascertain how many people and where the readers and listeners of Samizdat texts were. And what I discovered was that the KGB did much of my research for me. The KGB was very interested, for obvious reasons, in how many people and where were on the receiving end of dissident texts. So we know that Samizdat, the hand-typed, reproduced, and shared text, were reaching virtually every mid to large Soviet city across all 11 time zones. And we know anecdotally that listening to the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and the BBC was a very common pastime among Soviet citizens, especially at night and especially among the retired who had a lot of free time to do this. And I also want to say that the Soviet population was very well educated and especially very well technologically educated, a high proportion of engineers, that is to say, people who without too much trouble could convert what started as an FM or an AM radio into something that could receive shortwave broadcasts. So my sense is that the number of listeners to all of those radio stations, Mark, that you referenced was probably in the tens of millions. And that's an extraordinary fact when you think about the ability of Western entities to reach the hearts and minds of Soviet citizens during the Cold War.
You know, if I can, I'm working on another book on the radios, and obviously I'm going to have a big chapter on human rights and so forth. So I've been looking at documents that are at the Hoover Archives. I spent a few weeks there in the fall working there. And I came across some very interesting material, Ben, that you might find fascinating, that the radios took. When I speak the radios, I'm thinking of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, just a shorthand. We called them the radios. Had conferences bringing in specialists from the United States to discuss how much should Radio Liberty broadcast. And there's a wonderful conference held, I believe, in 1974 at the radios, in which they invited people like Maurice Friedberg, Alexander Dallin, Richard Pipes, Peter Redaway, a number of people to come and spend a day discussing détente, dissidents, how much. And of course, as you could imagine, Richard Pipes saying more is needed. And Alexander Dallin said, now, wait a second. You don't want to be only a dissident radio station. You've got to reach out beyond that. And so what I want to sort of bring in is that the radios took this very, very seriously. Are we doing too much? Are we becoming only the voice of the dissidents? And are we losing, as you mentioned, those engineers and educated who would be interested but wanted so much more than that? They wanted political news, they wanted cultural news, they wanted literature, a whole host of things. And they didn't want to be tied down just to dissident activity. But I think what I'm going to try to communicate in the book that I'm working on is the deliberate, thoughtful, analytical work that the radios did to sort of see what is the right mix that we should be doing and how much they drew on the European and the American sort of academia to help guide them through this process and to give them sort of a sense of what was just the right balance.
Yes, I have not read those conversations, but I like you, I'm a huge fan of the Hoover Archive, and they have acquired the sort of internal archive, as you know, of both RFE and RL, which are just huge and fantastic collections that I think will help spawn multiple books on multiple topics. The decision about what to cover and how much to cover, was as much political as it was scholarly or academic. The moment when that debate, I think, bursts out into the open, the conferences that you're describing were not publicly accessible at the time, as far as I know. But the moment when it bursts out into the open is in 1977, when a returning Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post, a man named Peter Osnos, who happens to be the father of Evan Osnos, a New Yorker writer who produced a fantastic book about China. Peter Osnos published an article in the Columbia Journalism Review in which he said, "We are devoting way too much attention to the dissidents. This is giving a distorted impression of Soviet realities, and it is, in a sense, inflating the dissident movement itself." And that unleashed a firestorm of controversy, not least, as you can imagine, among Soviet dissidents who did not welcome that message. But for me, it opened up a very interesting problem, which was the Western gaze, Western attention, above all by foreign correspondents working in Moscow and reporting back to their newspapers, but also the voices, the shortwave radio broadcast services. They, as observers and reporters on the dissident movement, were so powerful that they actually affected the trajectory of the movement itself. They made certain individuals extraordinarily famous, household names around the world. And of course, when they shined that very bright spotlight onto those extremely prominent figures, the figures they helped make so prominent, Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, Sharansky, others, they left many other figures in the shadows. That's what very bright spotlights do. And I became convinced at one point that the figures in the shadows, about whom we know so much less, were actually the founders and drivers of the movement, much more than the marquee names like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov.
You know, Ben, you might be interested in knowing that the Voice of America ran into problems during the years of détente with directives coming, and this is in the Nixon sort of forward years, where détente was very much the, and I write a little bit about it in my book on the Voice of America Russian broadcast, but for example, Solzhenitsyn was not to be, his works were not to be read. He could only be referred to by reference to a Western publication, but you could not do interviews with him because that would irritate the Soviet Union. That would be something that we did not want. In other words, there was in the U.S. government, especially in the State Department, there was great hesitancy about these dissidents and why are you doing it? We've got bigger fish to fry, and these people are just getting in the way. Yes. So that same attitude was very much prevalent, and it really broke in the with Carter. I mean, Carter is the president who just changed that radically by saying these are important people, human rights are important. And in my many conversations with former dissidents and so forth, they always talked about that break with Carter as being so important in terms of giving them moral sustenance.
Yeah, I would just say give a few footnotes to what you just said. The first position that you described, that dissidents and their campaigns for civil and then human rights were a distraction from the larger issues of the Cold War. That was certainly the position of the person who arguably had the greatest influence on American foreign policy during the 1970s, and that was Henry Kissinger, as National Security Advisor and then as Secretary of State, and for a while both. Kissinger's view was the relationship between Moscow and Washington is first and foremost about preventing nuclear war, about preventing the annihilation of the human race on planet Earth. And that was just so much more important and consequential than the particularities of the Soviet Union's success or failure in observing its own laws or in observing human rights norms. So he saw the dissidents not just as an annoying irritant, but as potentially a real threat to détente and to the architecture of arms control that he was trying to build with his Soviet counterparts. The other thing I would say is that, and this only emerged in the mid-1970s, there was tremendous diversity of opinion within the dissident movement about fundamental political issues, about what kind of Soviet government they desired, about what had to change in the Soviet Union in order for it to become a law-abiding society. So sooner or later, it was going to become clear that there was no one dissident politics that the West could either promote or not promote. It was going to have to choose from the spectrum. And here, just to return to Yuri's original question about the ultimate impact of the movement, this was a movement about spreading legal consciousness and about getting the Soviet government to obey its own laws, including the civil liberties that were outlined in the Soviet Constitution. My argument is that the dissident movement failed on both of those counts. It did not really produce a heightened legal consciousness in most of the Soviet population, and it certainly didn't produce a more law-abiding Soviet state. In fact, the many, many attempts to use the Soviet legal system to put dissidents on trial, while it always produced the desired outcome from the government's point of view, with just a handful of exceptions, the dissidents were always found guilty, and they were always sentenced to lengthy terms in prison or in the camps or in exile. The political dividends of those trials for the government were disastrous because they almost always made the dissidents look like heroes and martyrs. And the effect, and of course the dissidents didn't intend this, but the actual effect of those trials was to move the KGB more and more into extra-legal, extrajudicial techniques for handling the dissident movement. That is, it made the Soviet government even less law-abiding than it was originally intending to be in the aftermath of the Stalin era. But there was another unintended effect of the movement. History is full of unintended consequences, and that is that in the process of the Soviet state becoming less and less law-abiding, it lost legitimacy in the eyes of a significant portion of the Soviet population, as well as its observers and in some cases fans outside the Soviet Union. A state that cannot honor its own laws looks very archaic, looks very unmodern. And I think that loss of legitimacy, one of the unintended outcomes of the movement, was a contributing factor to why the Soviet regime collapsed so quickly when it did. There were many other factors that produced the collapse, but the draining of legitimacy from the system, an unintended outcome of the dissident campaign for the rule of law, was quite significant in my view.
It almost sounds like what you're saying is that it's less important to defend Constitution or, Constitution than it is to show suffering.
Well, but this is a very specific kind of suffering. It's not just people being wronged. It's people being prosecuted for doing things that are not illegal, according to Soviet law itself.
I have a hard time imagining Soviet people being concerned about those things.
Well, you'd be surprised. Some of them reacted by saying what the dissidents were up to was just a semantic game. They were just playing a game of cat and mouse with the state.
Yeah, except they were playing cat and mouse with a tiger.
Yes, and it's always the mouse that loses, not the cat. But at the same time, the repeated violation of its own laws by the Kremlin, by the KGB, I think gave many people the feeling that this was fundamentally a lawless, arbitrary regime, not a modern, institutionalized, law-driven state, which it repeatedly presented itself as being.
But that's never been Russia.
Well, you're right. Russia has never been known for the durability of its law and institutions, but the Soviet government very much presented itself as being a law-abiding state. The number one solution that Khrushchev offered against the cult of personality was, as he put it, socialist legality. The KGB made a very sustained and I think good faith effort to professionalize itself out of the dungeons of wanton violence that reached its peak in the late 1930s. So I wouldn't trivialize at least the aspiration towards law, the regularity and predictability that goes along with law, and the institutional clarity that law promises, at least if it doesn't always deliver. You're right, Yuri, that there was a tremendous dose of cynicism in many Soviet people's attitudes towards their state. But coexisting with that cynicism in ways that are rather enigmatic was a sense that this was a great state, this was a superpower, this was a quintessentially modern, future-oriented state, and modern states operate according to the rule of law. That's a hallmark of what it means to be modern.
The conversation you just had, the two kind of points of view that I heard, pretty much resonated in the halls of Radio Liberty every day. And we had a group of the dissident broadcasters who did daily programs, Documents and People, Samizdat readings, human rights programming. And then we had the group kind of on the other side of the corridor who said, come on, we're wasting way too much time on this. The Soviet Union is rotten. This is all, yes, talk about people who have suffered, but that's it. Let's go on and talk about how to change the country in a more fundamental way. This is not the way to change it. We had different points of view. This is something else that most people don't realize, is that Radio Liberty had broadcasters who spanned from quite outright socialists who were trying to find Leninist democracy to outright today's Putin supporters. I mean, people who were very much in the same nationalist vein that we see in Putin's Russia. They coexisted at the radios, and these conversations, I would say, created a lot of fiery staff meetings where people would really go at each other precisely along these lines. Why are we spending all of this time talking about these dissidents who are not important? Some people would say at Radio Liberty, and others would say, no, this is fundamentally important. We have to get them on the air.
I would like to clarify, because it's not about dissidents so much, but I think, Mark, as you and I discussed, that there were many different kinds of dissidents. And I feel like the dissidents, I agree with you that the dissidents who were focusing on the legality issue of things were some of them, but they were not the majority of dissident, were they?
Well, Solzhenitsyn did not call himself a dissident for the simple reason that he did not want to be associated with this legality and so forth. I think it divided very much. And as Ben said earlier, dissidents were not a unified movement. They were very different individual people. But one thing that has always intrigued me, I didn't approach it so much academically as just simply interacting day to day with these people. And, I knew Oleg Ginsburg very well. I knew Eddie Kuznetsov very well. I mean, these are people I worked with. Eddie Kuznetsov was on my staff. I mean, I saw him every day. Zhenya Khrushchev, whom you mentioned, I knew quite well. Actually, we were pretty close friends. Yulia Vishnevskaya, the 16-year-old girl who came out, was a good friend of mine. I still keep up with her, and we're still on Facebook many years later. What always amazed me about them, it made me feel rather small and bourgeois, was just how dedicated they were to concepts of freedom, of human dignity. They operated on a moral level that I personally admired very much, even though I had no possibility of ever reaching those heights myself. But I always had this sense that they, beyond anything else they did in society, they reminded me that human beings can be extraordinary, that human beings can do brave things for moral reasons, for moral issues. I recently saw Alexander Podrobinek, also a very important dissident. He came to University of Texas. I did a program with him at UT where we talked about, I recently read his book. He has, by the way, a wonderful book on the dissident movement, Ben, that you might want to look at.
Yes.
There's a couple of appearances on Rashkin Report. Yes, please continue.
Again, look at he could have emigrated. They urged him, no, he would rather go to a gulag for the principle of staying in the country and helping to sort of raise the moral issues. It's amazing. It just simply reminds me that as many evil people as we have in the world, we have these, I don't know exactly the right word to use, but people who stand at a higher moral ground than the vast majority of people could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like a disability.
No, I find it personally, I find it admirable, even though I can't possibly relate to it.
This was a question that interested me quite a bit because I don't want to generalize in any kind of facile way, but much of what had been written about the dissident movement when I started working on it did have a certain hagiographic quality. There was a sense that these were moral giants, and certainly the coverage of the movement in real time while it was unfolding, say between 1966 and 1982, was mostly by journalists, mostly by observers, and in most cases, they were in awe of the people that they were writing about. And the memoir literature more or less reinforces that image of moral giants. My brief in my book was not to cut them down to size, but I did want to step away from the hagiographic approach and capture them in the fullness of their humanity. And what I'm hearing, Yuri, from your intervention is that this, what in Russia is called principialnost, this sense of following ideas to the end of the road, no matter where that road leads. This is a quality that we associate, going all the way back to the 19th century with some of the revolutionaries and the underground thinkers. And when you get close to these people and see the consequences of following an idea to the end of the road, no matter where that road leads, it can sometimes be both a morally awesome spectacle, but also catastrophic for the friends and family of the individuals, not to mention the individual, him or herself, if that road leads to prison or death or assassination. And it's a many-sided coin that we're dealing with here. It's a very humanly complex phenomenon. What is clear is that the dissidents have been perceived by many Westerners as moral icons and has caused many people to ask themselves, I think, Mark, as you did, and many of the people that I spoke with and whose work I read for this book, Westerners ask themselves, what would I have done if I had lived in that time and place? Would I have stuck my neck out and taken the kinds of risks that the dissidents took, or would I have sort of stayed on the sidelines and tried to aid them, or would I have been turned off by their moral extremism? And it's almost as if their story inspires a kind of vicarious self-examination among observers. And I see this among Russians today who look back on the history of dissent in the Soviet Union and ask themselves, who would I have been if I had been born 40 years earlier than I was? And you may both of you may know that for several years in the 2010s, there was a campaign in the Moscow metro system where the Sakharov Center in Moscow, which has been liquidated on the eve of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they created a poster that each of the posters began with "Я не Sakharov," no, I'm not Sakharov, but, and then a series of answers could follow. But I know how to defend what I believe is right, or I know how to stand up for the rights of others. And this, to me, perpetuates the sense of the dissidents as these moral super beings. That, to me, is not helpful, because that implies that they are in some ways categorically different from other human beings. And what I learned in my book is that while they were extremely brave and very high-minded, and in some cases extraordinarily accomplished in their chosen fields, that certainly applies to people like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, but also to many others, they were not only people like you and I, they were Soviet people. They were products of the Soviet system. And many aspects of their high-mindedness, of their principialnost, really reminded me of the kind of high-mindedness that the Communist Party sought to instill in young Soviet people. So the challenge that I faced in my work was to show how these people and the movement that they made emerged from within Soviet society itself. They weren't Western liberals who were parachuted into the Soviet Union. They weren't from another planet. They were all born after the revolution. They went to school in Soviet institutions and were raised within the force field of Soviet propaganda. That was the challenge for me, was to understand them as Soviet people.
If I may add to that, one of the principles that we found at the radios, both at VOA and at RL, is as important as dissidents were for our programming, we could not hire them as broadcasters. And the reason why we couldn't hire them is because a broadcaster has to take in all kinds of different points of view. The whole point of being a journalist is to mediate, and bring in different points of view and not only say what you believe in, but to reflect honestly the various points of view. And they were not capable and not interested in doing that kind of work. They had an agenda that they wanted to pursue. And
Yes.
for that reason, we could invite them as guests to be on the program, but we couldn't turn over the microphone and say, okay, now here you're going to do a program, because they would only say one thing, and that is what they believe in, and no other point of view could ever be brought in, and no other dissident with whom they might disagree should not be speaking as well, because it's only my group and my little tribe that's going to be saying whatever it is. I had a long and complicated relationship with Lyudmila Alexeyeva, who was a harsh critic of the radios because she thought we were giving Solzhenitsyn too much time. Solzhenitsyn thought we were giving her too much time. I had to mediate between these two groups. And we finally, we did not hire Lyudmila Alexeyeva at VOA or at Radio Liberty, but we gave her time on the air because we felt that what she had to say and how she presented it and so forth was important. But she could not be, for the reasons you outlined so well, just a regular correspondent, because that would simply not work. They were ideologues in a certain sense, very committed to their point of view, and don't bother me with other ideas and other points of view.
Mark, I don't know how much of this interpersonal material is going to make its way into your book, but whatever does it, you really should think seriously about writing a memoir, a personal memoir of your experience, because there really aren't any other people I know of who can tell those stories.
Yeah, well, in the book that, and I'll send you a copy later this week or next week. I'll send you a copy of my book on Cold War radio, because I do have some parts that are personal, not a lot, but some parts where I spent 3 days with Solzhenitsyn in Vermont, interviewing him and having him read to me from August 1914. So I spent 3 days having lunch with him, dinner with him, listening to him, talking to him. We inevitably, of course, went on to many different topics. I have a chapter on that, although. So I'll be happy to send you that. But the point that I think is important is that these people were very, they were not liberals in any Western sense of that word, and didn't want to be. And that's the other thing. They had their own vision of what they wanted to accomplish or see.
Yes. It's also important to remember that for all of their devotion, I'm not including Solzhenitsyn here, but certainly Alexeyeva, who I was privileged to meet, for all their devotion to the rule of law and constitutionalism, they themselves had quite critical views of Western societies and Western politics. And, today it doesn't sound strange to say maybe the American political system is not looking so magnetic to the foreign audience. They themselves had grave doubts about multi-party democracy and what seemed to be the chaos of the American political system. And as Alexeyeva said herself in her fantastic memoirs called The Thaw Generation, there's a big difference between a Westerner and a Westernizer. So you're absolutely right. It's a mistake to look at Soviet liberals, look at Soviet dissidents and assume that they were liberals, as we use the term.
A question that I'd like to ask you, Dr. Nathan, is what I'm wondering about is myself being a mass communication person. Is this the medium, or is this the content? Who is leading the drive here? Is it the radio? Is it the dissidents? And maybe one way to try to determine the influence of radio is to talk about things that radio didn't cover very much, which is things happening outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And so I was wondering, in your book, to what extent do you feel that you've been able to, because memoirs are great. What can you tell us about dissidents outside of those two main big Soviet Russian cities? What was happening in republics and regions?
Sure. Your initial point is absolutely right. The portion of Samizdat that made it onto the shortwave broadcasts in what we would now call audio books or audio essays, that's in practice what they were, was very small. So it was a highly selective process of deciding what portion of the huge flood of samizdat would actually reach tens of millions of listeners in the Soviet Union. And of course, Western journalists were generally not allowed to travel very much outside of Moscow. So Moscow became the place where you could, if you were successful, have access to foreign correspondence. What do we know about dissent and samizdat outside of Moscow and Leningrad? Well, again, I would say the KGB did a lot of my research for me. The KGB had its own version of network theory. It was very interested in capturing the distribution networks by which information made its way to the editors, say, of the most widely read samizdat periodical, the Chronicle of Current Events. It was also interested in the networks by which hand-typed copies of the Chronicle made their way across the Soviet Union. We know that samizdat was both produced and consumed in virtually every major Soviet city. Dozens of cities were discovered. This is in the famous Case 24, the investigation of the Chronicle by the Fifth Directorate of the KGB, the directorate responsible for dissent and crushing dissent. So we know that the distribution and creation networks encompass the full geography of the Soviet Union. But as with the Soviet system itself, so with the dissident movement, Moscow was the nerve center of the entire operation. And for dissidents in Kiev or in Riga or in Oryol or in Ryazan or in Irkutsk to have any hope of reaching Western correspondents, a Western public, but also the much larger Soviet listening public that could only be reached through the voices, they had to go through Moscow. And that gave an additional dose of power to those dissidents who were based in Moscow. Now, I think it's worth just mentioning here that I like to use the word dissident in the Soviet sense of the word. That is, people who were trying to reform the Soviet system. So the Western definition is much more elastic and has typically, historically, included basically anyone who had any kind of gripe with the Soviet system. Ukrainian national dissidents were not really interested in reforming the Soviet system so much as they were in obtaining greater autonomy for the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture, and at the extreme end of the movement, outright independence and sovereignty for a Ukrainian state. I would say the same thing about dissidents in Lithuania. So the national movements and the religious movements, which numerically were far greater than the pravozashitniki, who numbered maybe 1,000 in terms of the hardcore producers of rights defending samizdat and who signed open letters and petitions, the national and religious movements were much, much greater, but their access to Western journalists was more limited. And it must be said, Western journalists, like human beings generally, they found what they wanted to find, and what resonated with them were things that spoke to their own values. So people who were speaking the language of the rule of law and human rights and human dignity, they got much more attention than their numbers by themselves would have warranted. But let's face it, small groups make history. We know this from example after example. Small groups of determined individuals have always had an outsized impact on the flow of historical change. And I think that's true of the Soviet dissidents as well.
If I may add, one point that the Radio Liberty wanted to do very much, in addition to just samizdat and dissidents, is to sort of raise the whole issue of what are human rights, why are they important. The Helsinki Accords became a very important vehicle for that, and hence the Moscow-Helsinki group that was formed by Alexeyev and others in Moscow. Also very much what was happening in Eastern Europe. And here the radios had, of course, the ability to get information about what was happening in Poland, what was happening in Czechoslovakia, what was happening elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc, and feed that into the programs that went to the Soviet Union. So you had this cross-reporting. Solidarity becomes very important in the 80s as an example of how groups form. And so there were also efforts at Radio Liberty, not just to report on the small group of правозащитники, the rights, but to kind of open up the issue of why are human rights so important? Why do people pay so much attention? Why does President Carter and then later President Reagan consider it so fundamental to the relationship that the United States has with other countries? And so it was intentional to also raise that issue to a broader level and not just focus on the narrow samizdat or materials coming out of the Soviet Union. So we had a whole, this was a big area of broadcasting on many, many different levels.
I mean, I think one way of bringing home the extraordinary impact over decades of the Western radio services is if I just come out and say, I think those radio services reached many more Soviet citizens and had a greater impact on conversations inside the Soviet Union than the Kremlin did in the 2016 election, when it was alleged that Russian influence was tipping the scales of the American electorate. It's hard to quantify these things, but if you just look at the duration and the intensity of the ability of the Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and the Voice of America and the BBC and all the others to reach tens of millions of Soviet listeners over decades, it dwarfs whatever it is that the FSB and other services were able to achieve in 2016.
But the tasks were
the difference being we
so
didn't have,
different.
but we didn't have any goal to achieve. We weren't trying to bring down the Soviet Union. Nobody had any illusions that anything that we were, and it's an interesting question looking back at, we thought we were simply informing people and keeping alive cultures that were otherwise being suppressed.
That's a goal. So you did have goals. The goal,
but the goals were not per se political. Nobody expected the Soviet Union to disappear. If it became milder and softer, that would be nice. Obviously, Gorbachev was something that we grappled with and welcomed and presented. But the idea wasn't that there was some group in the Soviet Union that we wanted in power and another group we didn't. I think that would simply, we couldn't even conceive of the Soviet Union not being there forever.
yes.
And so our goal, I think, at least how we saw it, was rather modest.
It's true that there was almost nobody could imagine toppling the Soviet system, including almost all the dissidents who never dreamed that such a thing would be possible, certainly not in their lifetime. But I think it's fair to say that the voices were designed to shift conversations and open people to a new set of ideas. You can have political goals without necessarily thinking in terms of regime change. So, of course, the Russian campaign in the 2016 election was much cruder. It was also full of lies. It was really designed to disinform rather than to inform or open up the horizons of thinking of American citizens. I'm not suggesting that kind of analogy at all. I'm just trying to say the degree of influence, I think, was much less than what the voices were able to exercise year after year during the last, say, 20 years of the Cold War. It's an impressive.
But then at the same time, I can say that in the influence of disinformation in 24 election probably does exceed Voice of America influence on Soviet Union.
You mean disinformation coming from Russia in the 2024 election? Because I think we have our own homegrown disinformation that is more than up to the job of confusing people.
On this channel, we have reasonable suspicions that maybe the two are interconnected.
But not my area of expertise, but
right. So it's a speculation, of course, because but nonetheless, I think it's an interesting idea of taking certain moments in time and comparing them against others, which is intriguing.
This question, Ben, that you sort of raised in some way, I've been asked by various people. What did you see as your goal in broadcasting? And as I look back on my 11 years in broadcasting, which I'm very proud of, I would say for me, it was a moral matter. We were giving to people their own history and culture that was being denied to them. whether it was in religion, whether it was in the Jewish programs, the Orthodox programs, the literature programs, the poetry programs, the history programs. We were giving to them what they were being denied by their state. And I think the vast majority of Radio Liberty programming was cultural, was readings. It was authors who had been sent to the gulag and forgotten. It were people who, so the dissidents fit into that, but they certainly weren't the only thing that we were broadcasting about.
Yeah.
And I think the moral dimension is something that was always there in the background, that this was the right thing to do. And of course, it backed up much of what the United States stood for: free flow of information. There was no disinformation. You can look at every program up and down Radio Liberty for 40 years, and you will not find any example. Now, there could be weak programs. There could be programs that in retrospect you say, boy, that was a dumb program. But then any human activity has, on occasion, done stupid things, or put the wrong program on, or had the wrong person on the air, and so forth. But there was no such thing as news that was not verified by independent sources, whether it's Reuters, AP, UPI, and so forth. So it was its record is very admirable. And I would say it's open now in the archives to all of anyone to look at it.
Yes.
So I think our approach was, first of all, rather modest. We didn't think we were going to change anything. We were hopeful that some people were listening, but we didn't know for sure. And we thought we would focus on things that reflected the values that we thought represented the best of the West. So it's really a matter of values more than anything else.
There's no question that the moral motives and the moral level on which these campaigns were conducted was very, very different in the two cases. And I would also say that according to the people that I've spoken to, and again, you know much more about this than I do, but you're right that the majority of programming was cultural, and one of the most lasting impacts was among people who love to listen to American jazz and other Western music that was otherwise almost inaccessible. I mean, these left very lasting traces in people's lives. They were a lifeline to a culture from which they were otherwise cut off.
Radio Liberty broadcast all of the Beatles in the 60s, when
yes.
the Beatles could not be presented at all. I may also add something that I wonder if you are, maybe Pavel Litvinov told you if you had an interview with him, but he and others have talked about the
also regular, been guest on Rashkin Report, Pavel Litvinov, absolutely.
The importance of the American civil rights movement, that the Voice of America covered in the greatest of details. It too was nonviolent. It too wanted the United States to adhere to its own laws. And the Voice of America in particular, not Radio Liberty, but VOA, spent a lot of time in the 60s broadcasting about the civil rights movement. You can find photos of Martin Luther King interviewed by VOA, interviewed by Radio Liberty. They're wonderful photos of direct interviews, and many others as well. But that was a theme. And the reason why the Voice covered it, of course, is because the Soviet Union presented the situation, the racial situation, in very propagandistic terms. And so the Voice said, well, we'll look at it exactly what's going on. If there are protests, we're going to report on them. These are the views. And I think that had also an influence on some of the dissidents, seeing how that civil rights movement was being played out in the United States.
Yeah. As you know, Pravda and Izvestia also covered the movement in great detail. And of course, as you mentioned, with the particular slant. And it would be fascinating to compare the coverage by the VOA on the one hand and the mass circulation Soviet newspapers on the other. I have a whole section in the book where I compare the sort of the choreography of the two movements, the civil rights movement in the United States on the one hand, and the civil rights movement in the Soviet Union on the other. Because let's remember, the dissident movement began as a civil rights movement, appealing to Soviet laws and Soviet civil liberties, things that were enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. And it's only when that approach or that method failed, because the Soviet government never responded to the appeals and the petitions to observe its own law. It's only when that failed that they changed the movement to be more oriented towards international rights norms, which is to say human rights norms that the Soviet Union had endorsed and ratified and was obliged to honor. The most tangible channel of influence that I came across in my work when it comes to the coverage of the American civil rights movement on the one hand, and the set of practices and ideas among Soviet dissidents, and Pavel Litvinov in particular, who I have interviewed many times and consider a friend. The famous demonstration in Red Square on August 25th, 1968. This was the demonstration to protest the invasion of Czechoslovakia that crushed the Prague Spring. That is a reform movement very much like what the dissidents had in mind for the Soviet Union. That demonstration was called by its architects a сидящая демонстрация, which was their term for a sit-down demonstration, which is what the demonstrations in the American South in the 60s were often called. That's the most direct line of influence that I've been able to find. The dissidents drew on a number of different traditions, including Gandhi, including Tolstoy, including their own, they mostly were scientists, including their own attempt to make sense of the Soviet legal system as non-professional participants in that system. There are very few lawyers in the movement. It was really dominated by people in what we would now call the STEM fields. So the intellectual history of the movement and how it absorbed foreign examples, but also how it made sense of the Soviet legal system itself is incredibly interesting.
Yeah. One thing that you do in your book, and I think very, very important for a lot of Americans reading your book, is you kind of disentangle the Jewish emigration process of the 1970s from the dissident movement. And I think the two very often get intermixed by people who look at that period and don't realize that there was an emigration. Some of them, as you say, Sharansky, for example, was both. I mean, he was both a dissident and eventually part of the emigration. Some were not. And I think for the radios, that was also a very important kind of, do we put the Jewish issue in human rights program, or do we have a separate Jewish program? And initially it was all in human rights, and then there was carved out a special Jewish program every week only on Jewish issues, on immigration, on Jewish culture. There's an example, by the way, of what the Radio Liberty considered very important. As people were being denied their culture, their religion, we had a separate Jewish program that went on every week. We had a separate Orthodox program that went on every week. The idea being that we're just simply allowing them to continue their culture that is being denied. But I think you do a very, very important job, I think, for someone looking back at that period, to disentangle those two separate but in some ways related movements.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's just fascinating to hear you talk about the internal debates in the radio stations, because a version of them was also being conducted inside the editorial team that produced the Chronicle of Current Events. They too eventually decided to have a regular dedicated section to what they called news from the Jewish community. And they had sections dealing with the Crimean Tatars and with dissent among religious believers, especially evangelical Christians. Mm-hmm. So there's just a fascinating parallel in these, I think, totally separate, distinct conversations, but that were responding to the same challenges and same dilemmas. You're right that in the Western view, there was a widespread tendency to conflate dissident with refusnik, Jews who had applied to leave the Soviet Union and been denied permission. The confusion was not helped by the fact that a very high proportion of the rights defenders, the правозащитники, who themselves did not seek to emigrate, but wanted to reform the Soviet system, make it more law-abiding, a very high proportion of them had one or more Jewish parents. And so were defined according to Soviet passport regulations as ethnically Jewish themselves. And the KGB, being the KGB, was not going to pass up the opportunity to stigmatize the dissident movement by describing it as essentially a Zionist conspiracy against the Soviet Union. So the same dynamics that applied to the revolutionary movement in the pre-1917 era, where a high proportion of those arrested for revolutionary underground activity were Jews, seemed to just repeat itself with the dissident movement. Obviously, this is a very different generation of people. Most of them knew no Jewish languages, were not very Jewishly literate, did not have any particular ties to Israel, either as an idea or as an actual political reality. But they couldn't escape the fact that, in the eyes certainly of the Soviet population and of their passports, they were regarded as being Jews themselves. And there's a joke that I quote from the poet Naum Kurjavin, who said that, we really ought to be fair. People are claiming that 85% of the dissident movement consists of Jews. It really ought to be 50-50. As if that would be a desirable outcome for a country in which Jews constituted less than 3% of the population.
All the people that you mentioned that once they emigrated or were traded for various spies like Ginsburg and Sharansky, they all ended up in one way or another at the radios, either as guests or they would come in. So, this was part, the conversations they would have in Moscow would continue in our canteen in the basement of the Munich headquarters. I mean, this was all one interrelated group. And of course, the radios received a lot of this information that came through private channels to various people leaving the country and so forth. So it was one very much integrated. Even though I was not in the Soviet Union, I felt in many ways I lived among these people, at least in the West.
Yeah, you're extremely lucky to have been alive and working in that time and place. I came into the topic much later. I did manage to interview quite a few of the dissidents who were still alive when I was working on the book, from Pavel Litvinov and Ludmila Alexeyeva to Larisa Bogoraz and Alexander Yesenin-Volpin himself. But those were the ones who were still around, and so many had already died by the time I started my research. And of course, only a handful are really left today.
You had mentioned the Crimean Tatars, and I was looking at a list of I just randomly took 79 and 80, 81 just to see who was being interviewed. And the leader of the Crimean Tatars, Aisha Said Muratova, had 19 programs devoted to the Crimean Tatars in just that period, and several interviews as well. Yesenin-Volpin was interviewed 8 times in just 1979 alone. I mean, just to give you the sense of how much their presence was on the radios. And these were programs that were repeated many times so that they would reach different parts of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, those interviews and the attention to people who were coming out of the Soviet Union, I can tell you, meant a tremendous amount to those individuals, to have the sense that they were being paid attention to, that they were on the radar screen of people in the West. And less remarkable, perhaps, but no less important, the Soviet leadership was astonishingly sensitive to those interviews and to coverage of human rights issues in the Soviet Union. This, I think, is something that's no longer true in today's Russia. I really think Putin and Lavrov and Medvedev just don't care that much about what is said in the West. But I remember reading transcripts of Politburo conversations in which Leonid Brezhnev would complain about human rights coverage in the Soviet Union by my hometown newspaper. I grew up in Baltimore, and the Baltimore Sun would have articles about violations of human rights in the Soviet Union, and Brezhnev would bring this up at meetings of the Politburo. It's extraordinary. Can you imagine an American president even knowing the name of a provincial Russian newspaper, much less taking the time to be irritated by its coverage of the United States? This is an indispensable fact for making sense of why the Soviet Union was so sensitive to those kinds of criticisms. It's because the Soviet system regarded itself as the avant-garde of human rights. And only in a Marxist socialist system could human rights in their truest form be realized. So the criticism definitely hit a nerve.
Well, I will perhaps end our conversation with, well, I do have one more question. So last question. We have a comment from our viewer who writes in Russian, so I will translate it into English. I'm sitting here holding the phone by my ears to more clearly hear English, and I caught myself thinking, ooh, back in the USSR, when I was little, and Dad and I were both leaning towards the radio and listening to Voice of America. Dr. Nathans, what are some of the lessons and conclusions that you suggest we make from your book to today's situation where we are today?
The situation today for people who think that human rights and civil rights and the rule of law are important in Russia is quite grim. And the danger of dissenting and protesting, I think, is even more acute now than it was in the late Soviet period. I don't believe that the rule of law is the answer to all questions, because after all, governments can create their own laws at will. And one of the things that I think Vladimir Putin learned, and his advisors learned from the late Soviet experience, was to be much more agile and much more professional in the use of law, the use and abuse of law, and the use of public relations. Nonetheless, I think one of the things that I draw from the dissident experience is that the rule of law and taking rights seriously has to be an indispensable component of any credible political solution. Any set of political reforms must be grounded in the rule of law. Even if that's not sufficient, it is an absolutely necessary component. And the cost of not including that component and of not having that built into the way a country works is unfolding in front of our eyes as we observe this absolutely brutal war that Russia is waging in Ukraine. And I won't even speak about the cost to Ukraine and Ukrainians, which is, of course, the number one form of suffering, but to Russia and Russians, the toll in terms of death, severely wounded young men, and the cost to the treasury and the burden on the Russian population that this war is going to impose for years and years thereafter is a consequence of a government that feels unconstrained by any serious legal institutions. We in the United States may be facing an analogous, I hope not in the form of a war, but an analogous challenge of a government that seems to be determined to ignore our own legal constraints. So the dissident agenda of the rule of law and of taking rights seriously, I think, is a warning sign for the authoritarian states of 2025 who are threatening those institutions wherever they can.
And like the dissidents, we need to stand up when we see violations. We need to not be silent, especially in the United States, where we have the luxury of having that right to speak. They did it in an environment where they took a great risk. We don't carry that risk, but we need to stand up and be dissidents as well. In many ways, the dissidents are of some sort are really very relevant across not just Russia, but the United States as well.
And finally, on a kind of psychological level, the dissidents did something extraordinary, which was captured in their toast that I made into the title of my book, "За успех нашего безнадежного дела," to the success of our hopeless cause. These were people, and we've talked about their qualities of bravery and stubbornness and persistence. These were people who were able to understand in a very sober, clear-eyed way how, in a sense, hopeless their cause actually was, how unlikely it was that this small group of people could actually do anything to substantially improve conditions of life inside the Soviet Union. And yet, they persevered in their cause. They did not abandon hope. They didn't succumb to apathy or to just purely symbolic gestures to make themselves feel better. They really thought long and hard about what needed to happen in the Soviet Union, and they didn't give up despite ferocious persecution by the KGB and a largely indifferent Soviet population. That's another good lesson to keep in mind.
Dr. Nathans, I do have to ask you, I guess, when you describe these dissidents as characters that brought suffering to themselves and people around them, were they themselves suffering, or were they themselves happy for they lived a moral life?
Well, it'd be hard to describe them as happy, although they did retain a sense of humor. I don't think happiness is part of the Russian or the Soviet formula.
Fair enough.
That's much more of an American preoccupation. What I would say, and it's an excellent question, what I would say is that when you look into the diaries and the letters and the sort of private internal documents that the dissidents produced at the time, what you find over and over again is that they simply couldn't bear to live with a version of themselves that was untrue. They couldn't, they needed to express themselves according to their beliefs. The people who went out on Red Square in August of 1968, they couldn't remain silent because they couldn't live with that version of themselves. They wanted to be true to their own best selves, as we would say in the United States. So it was in some ways a very personal decision. It wasn't just, I think invading Czechoslovakia is terrible. It was that, but it was also, I cannot engage in the sort of lip service of approving of the Soviet invasion, as so many people did. And I can't even live with the version of myself that remains silent. As Mark was saying earlier, they were driven to act on their beliefs, and they didn't want to be people who didn't do that, who failed to do that. So the psychology is quite specific.
In that case, thank you so much for your time. And I want to thank Mark Pomar, author of Cold War Radio, and Dr. Ben Nathans, author of To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause. I feel like raising a drink to that, like, to the success of, right? It's a Russian habit. You just hear toast, you want to drink. And anyway, Mark, thank you so much. Ben, thank you so much. You're listening and watching Rashkin Report. Hit like, subscribe, learn Russian or not, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Всего доброго.
Всего доброго.
Bye-bye.